Hello and welcome to the darkened room of music conversation.
I'm Darren.
And I'm Chris, and welcome to part one of a 3-part series on 90s alternative.
I'm really looking forward to this.
I am too. I mean, a lot happened in the 90s, and that's kind of what we're going to cover here in episode 1.
And we were there.
We lived it, and yeah, I'm feeling a little old. But
we were on radio, and we played many of these songs.
That's right, and in music retail as well.
Music retail as well.
So we saw what was going on, all of these trends, and as people who loved rock and roll, we were mainly rockers, you know, as far as, you know, pop rock, hard rock, heavy metal. You think back to the 90s if you're in that world, and you think of the 90s alternative that came out.
Naturally.
That's not the only thing that was going on. So we're going to cover that here. In part 2, we're going to talk about the best-selling rock albums of the decade and whether or not they have relevance today.
Yeah, we're going to look back in the rearview mirror and say, hey, what do we think about this now in retrospect?
Exactly right. And part 3 is going to be the evolution of the 90s alternative, all the different varying genres that fell under that umbrella.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Are we smart enough to do that?
We're going to find out.
We'll find out.
Yeah. So we'll get started on this one and see how the rest go.
Sounds great.
Right. So to talk about the 90s and what happened there, we have to take a look back and figure out what led us to that point. Mm-hmm. Go all the way back to the 50s, the beginning of rock and roll, and Mr. Elvis, just taking the world by storm. That's kind of where rock and roll began its reign in the pop world.
Absolutely. You got a guy who's obviously a white man.
Yeah.
Who loved R&B and black influenced music, and he brought that to a whole new audience, a pop audience, a white audience at the time, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's what put him on the map.
That's right. And if you think about it too, the whole record industry machine really started with rock and roll in the 50s as well. You saw a lot of labels hiring singers because they were pretty and they could sing well, and pushed them out there, and it was almost like a machine. You know, in the 90s, you think about when NSYNC and Backstreet Boys came along, how, this is just pre-manufactured, by the record company. Well, you know what? That's been going on since the 50s. Yeah, it's been part of rock, pop since then.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's a business. It's a music business. They want something they can sell. And if somebody looks a certain way or is attractive to a certain audience and it rings that cash register, they're all in.
That is right. Now, of course, the general public, music tastes, people get bored. New generations come along. They want their own thing. Right. So what happened in the 60s? We had the Beatles.
The Beatles.
Yeah, Beatles came in, took the world by storm as well.
Yeah, and I would say musically, there's never been any artists in any genre of music that had the impact that the Beatles had.
Right, yeah, I would agree with that statement for sure. Get along to the 70s now. Now, the 70s is an interesting era, but if you want to think about the rock and roll world, Boston started out what you would call the arena rock, the corporate rock. They were really the innovators of that, and you could call that its own revolution.
For sure. And you noticed at that time, a lot of bands went out. Labels were signing bands that had high-pitched vocalists. And even bands that didn't have high-pitched vocalists. As an example, Jefferson Starship, they had Marty Balin.
Yeah.
They replaced him with Mickey Thomas because he could sing a lot higher, kind of like the guy from Boston. And then Journey went out and got Steve Perry.
That's right, yeah.
Foreigner and Lou Gramm. It just went on. And that voice was very popular there for about 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah. And so kind of an answer to that, you wanted the gritty, ballsy stuff to come along. Well, in the 80s, Back in Black by AC/DC was released.
Yeah.
And you can count that as the beginning of a revolution, but I don't think it was until Def Leppard's Pyromania came out that it really got propelled into the mainstream.
I agree. I think with Pyromania, it really became like a mainstay on pop radio for months on end. And then I think that was the moment where, reluctantly maybe even, record labels were like, you know what, I'll take one of those kind of bands. Give me a Quiet Riot, give me a Rat, give me a Cinderella.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those bands kind of got a chance thanks to Def Leppard.
Yeah. So that lasted for a while. It had that slick, highly produced sound.
Once again, 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, that's
really
about
big.
it. And eventually another generation comes along, and they want their own thing.
Yeah.
They want something a little more organic.
Yeah.
Something more dirty, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Down to earth, real. They were looking for real.
You'll notice that in the music industry, it is a big carousel. And,
and
one thing is a reaction to something else. If it gets too heavy, then it lightens up for a little while.
Yeah.
The 80s, everything was happy, glammy, slick, produced. The 90s turned around and said, hey, we want something more real life, That's why even we talked about image and stuff. You saw the flannel shirts and the torn up blue jeans and people not taking showers. All of that was seriously a reaction to the 80s, a backlash to the 80s style.
Right, exactly right. As a result, we get Nirvana.
Right.
And the whole 90s alternative movement that came with it.
It exploded.
Yeah. As a rock fan, a lot of rock fans, in their mind, that was kind of a big deal. I mean, it was a huge deal. I know that because we lived through it, it felt like it was bigger than any other revolution that had ever happened.
Yeah, and I've told this story on the channel before, but I was in music retail at the time. I worked for a big music chain called Camelot Music.
Yeah.
And the day of release, we literally got one CD and one cassette of Nirvana. Now,
did not see it coming.
Did not see it coming. The label was clueless. The chain that I worked for, they were clueless. The industry was clueless. Within 48 hours, we were drop shipped like hundreds of those because it really did have that much demand from the get-go.
And you probably ran out of those within a day too.
Yeah, pretty much. We continually got them in for weeks on end.
Right.
Yeah.
So major deal. You would think that this was the revolution of the 90s, but there were other major genres going through their own revolutions. And really, when you look at the numbers, they were bigger than the 90s alternative movement.
And we've analyzed that, and we think we have some reasons why.
Yeah, because you can't think of the 90s without Garth Brooks.
Yeah.
Garth Brooks was huge.
He was.
At the turn of the decade.
Right.
And the amount of sales, the record sales that he produced is just mind-boggling.
It's very impressive. I'm not a fan of Garth, I'll just be honest, full disclosure. I mean, I think he's an all right guy, whatever. But I never really listened to his music. I've heard a song here or there that I thought, I understand why people like that.
Yeah.
But the numbers are what they are, and they're pretty damn strong.
They are. See, I didn't care for it either, but you cannot argue with 62 million record sales for the 7 albums that he released during the 90s.
All right.
Absolutely huge. That he outsold everybody in the whole 90s.
Yeah.
Shania Twain was out at the same time, and she was like a big deal when she came out.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting, she married Mutt Lange. Mutt Lange produced her records, and Mutt was at the beginning of the forefront of the AC/DC Def Leppard movement. So.
That's right, yeah. So a trendsetter on his own there.
Yeah.
26 million copies of her 2 albums is what she sold. I mean, this is just incredible.
It really is.
Yeah, the whole country movement, it was weird to me. It's like in the 80s with MTV and all that, even though, you had some people liking more of the heavy metal, some people liking more of the new wave, but we felt like we were all in the same boat.
Right.
As far as genre, musical taste, everyone could kind of, it's like we were getting along almost.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of disagreement, but when the 90s hit, it's like things splintered.
Yeah, and I wonder, though, I mean, I kind of felt the same way about the 70s.
Yeah.
We had episodes where we talked about that. I think the 70s were very, I don't want to say divisive, but very defined genres, where in the 80s, you had pretty much production styles that kind of took over.
Yeah.
And, artists that like Kenny Loggins, who used to be organic and acoustic, they're having these high-tech AOR sounding records,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Living happily beside, like the Human League or Lionel Richie even.
Yeah.
It was all being played on the radio at the same time. We were all a happy family.
Yeah, which brings me to another point I wanted to make too. When you look at the 80s, I've always said this, I think the 80s were more about productions and sounds.
Yeah.
Where the 90s, and we're about to deep dive into this. Actually, the 90s were more about styles, just like the 70s were. The 70s, you had disco, you had the singer-songwriter, you had the AOR, or corporate rock as you called it, and punk. And the 90s were very similar in that regard.
Very much so, yeah. Right. And, it wasn't just rock and country, making their own in-grounds. Rap and R&B had really pushed its way to the forefront as well.
Sure had.
Yeah. You think of at the very beginning of the decade, Vanilla Ice to the Extreme came out. You remember how big of a deal that was.
It was crazy, man. Once again, I was in music retail, sold it probably more intense than any release ever.
Yeah. Really, really pushed rap right into the mainstream pop world. Yeah, MC Hammer came out about the same time. Now, Vanilla Ice did 7 million copies. MC Hammer had better success, 10 million copies.
Yeah. In the end, the Vanilla Ice album did go diamond, though, right? 10 million.
I believe it did, but within the confines of the 90s, it was 7 million within the decade.
Still pretty good.
Yeah. So, Tupac also made a huge impact in the 90s. 10 million copies of his albums.
Crazy. And once again, I remember just selling them by the truckloads back in the day.
And his counterpart, I guess you could say, the Notorious B.I.G., selling 10 million as well.
Yeah.
So, rap really pushed its way into the pop world, whereas it was more kind of an underground thing. In the 80s, you had, Run DMC, of course.
Right.
It almost felt as if those kind of acts were novelties because you also had like the Fat Boys. It's like it was kind of goofy. I don't think it was taken as seriously until the 90s rolled around. So in the R&B world, you had Lauryn Hill and the Fugees selling 8 million copies. You had record labels searching out like a Motown throwback thing. That was a big deal. Like Boyz II Men, they sold 10 million copies. I mean, this is not the only thing going on is in the rock. You had the country and you had all this rap and R&B. And soundtracks too. I mean, how big was the Bodyguard soundtrack?
Oh my goodness, man. When I Will Always Love You was on the charts, I think it set a record at the time for the most weeks at number 1.
I think you're right.
It was crazy, and that thing just sold astronomically.
13 million copies. And of course, the Titanic soundtrack. Celine Dion doing her thing with 11 million copies of that.
And just for trivia, I know that Mariah Carey was the only artist in the 90s who had a number 1 hit every year of the 90s.
Look at that. Speaking of longest duration of a number 1 hit, she and Boyz II Men shared that for a little while as well.
Yes, they did.
With that one, I think it was One Sweet Day, right?
One Sweet Day, yeah.
So there you go.
See, and I can honestly say I've never heard that song all the way through.
Neither have I. Interpret that how you want.
Probably the less we say about it, the better, right?
Yeah. As you can see by these numbers, the record labels were riding high in the 90s.
Making that money.
Yeah. Now, how does this compare to all the other decades? You go back to the 1960s, total platinum sales. These are the ones that did, 1 million copies or more. Total sales throughout the whole decade, 57 million copies in the 60s. In the 70s, 345 million.
Big jump up.
Big, huge jump up.
Yeah.
A slight bump in that in the 80s with 380 million. The 90s, though, blew all of these records away. 479.1 million copies of all platinum sales in the 90s, the whole decade, sold.
So what you're saying is if you add up all the million platinum selling albums of the 90s,
1 million or more copies sold.
We're close to 480 million units.
That's right.
Wow.
All within the 90s. And several factors kind of went into this. One of the things is that the record labels stopped releasing singles as prominently as they used to.
Before we dog them out, let's give them a little credit.
Okay.
One of the things that I think aided in the sales was that for once, maybe the first time ever, the people that ran the music industry kind of stepped out of the way and let the music do its thing.
That is true.
I really believe that. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that you can't convince me they would have heard and were like, man, I'm excited about this. But they let it happen, and the taste, whatever it was with the consumer at that time, It was just the timing was right for a lot of weird stuff to get, like Beck and stuff like that, to get through the mainstream a little bit, and off it went.
And I think that contributed to the fact that country, alternative, and rap were having such outstanding periods there.
This is true.
The record labels let whatever come out. They let the artist be creative.
They really did.
Yeah.
I think it was probably, since the 70s, the most creative era of music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
comes at a price, at a cost.
They started withholding singles. Do you know what the first single was that was not a single? The record label withheld it from being a single. You had to buy the whole album in order to own it. Do you know what it was?
Are we talking this decade?
Yeah, the 90s.
Okay, so, I don't know, Pearl Jam?
No.
Okay.
It was Can't Touch This by MC Hammer.
How about that?
That was the beginning of that grand experiment, and that was part of the reason why, possibly, that these record sales skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be at the detriment a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you remember when George Strait released Check Yes or No?
I remember the song.
Yeah, okay. So that was not released as a single. The only place you could get that was from the box set.
Wow.
A box set. You had to buy
the whole box set
an entire $50, $60 box set in order to own that song if you wanted it.
What a different world it was.
It was, yeah. And I think that worked against them, because by the time the 2000s rolled around, the internet had started to evolve in the technology. People started to download. Napster comes along. 120 million copies of albums were sold in the 2000s.
Wow, that's
huge
a big
drop
dip.
off.
Big dip.
Yeah.
Well, why did the album sell to that degree in the first place?
Yeah.
I think there's some scientific reasons why.
I think so too. I think it was very much a generational thing.
I agree.
We grew up with parents in the 70s, who, they came from the baby boomer era. They started to absorb music. They grew up with the Beatles, and they became consumers of music.
And the album era.
Yeah, that's very true, because before the 60s, before the Beatles, it was very single-centric.
It was.
Yeah. But owning music was almost a status symbol.
I agree.
Yeah. I think you've mentioned that your parents just had hundreds of albums,
yes.
Yeah. And I remember my dad, had brought albums in all the time, and I was fascinated by the album covers as a young kid.
Yeah. And when my parents heard a song that they liked, they went out and bought the album.
Exactly right. And we grew up in that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we knew. And by the time we became 20, 21 years old,
and we had jobs.
We had money to spend.
Yeah.
That's what you did. You liked the music. You owned it. You went out and you bought it.
I agree. So that definitely was one of the cogs in the wheel. The other thing was, let's face it, the CD boom.
That's right. Yeah. The CD was a big, big deal.
Yes. So
we did an episode on the CD. You can watch that right here. The whole history of it.
A damn good episode, if we say so ourselves.
Yeah. But CDs became the thing. I mean, record stores stopped selling LPs. They took them completely out of the stores.
Right.
And eventually the cassette section on the wall started to shrink down. Smaller. Everyone was buying CDs.
That's exactly right. There were these big catalog campaigns. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but a lot of bands from, the classic rock era and stuff, they released all of their stuff on CD.
Yeah.
So just CD in general, it was at its peak.
Yeah.
And we're talking the early 90s to mid 90s. That was when it was just crazy how many units you could sell on compact disc.
Right.
Yeah.
So one interesting thing, we kind of looked this up. We were wondering how the Gen X numbers, the total number of Gen Xers, which is the group that we fall in, how did we stack up against baby boomers and millennials?
Yeah.
And we actually come up short.
Yeah.
There was fewer of us, but yet we were buying all this music, pushing these record sales.
And my theory about that is just, it's all about timing.
Yeah.
Even though we were fewer as far as the numbers go, the number of people that were buying CDs at that point, like I said, that was the big deal at that moment. It was a status symbol, like you said.
Yeah.
I think that number, it's a new format. Everybody's checking into it. And all of these albums coming out, and this was like an album-centric era.
Yeah.
These albums were, pretty good as a rule. Where in the 80s, I think things were more single-dominated.
It was, yeah. Thanks to, you could probably thank MTV for that.
Yeah. And then, we're in our 20s then. Like we said, we've already been basically groomed to buy the things that we like, the things that we hear that we like. We're working jobs now. We're getting a little bit older.
Yeah, we're getting older.
We're old enough to smell bad. Yeah. and so I think all of that it was all about the timing.
Yeah,
I really believe that. By the time the millennials came along, or Generation Y, or whoever was behind the Generation Xers, there wasn't really a new format, and I think that music had kind of like it wasn't as big a deal. Like when you remember when Def Leppard released an album, it was people would talk about it for months, or U2 before it even came out. There would be this big groundswell of, oh man, this is about to come out. They would release a single like 2 months before the album came out.
Yeah, that's true. But, entering into the 2000s with the internet, you entered into the world of instant gratification.
That's right.
So there was no longer any kind of looking forward anymore.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true.
So there you go. In a nutshell, the whole 90s, there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
A whole lot. Not just the 90s alternative. You had the country, you had the rap, the soundtracks, the record sales. Major record-setting decade for the music industry. So it was mega huge.
Yeah.
In the next episode, we're going to talk about one thing we haven't talked about here yet. It's the actual 90s alternative.
All right.
The rock world.
All right.
What were the major selling albums from that decade? And we're also going to delve into, are they still relevant today?
Yeah.
So watch out for that episode coming up soon.
Should be an interesting discussion.
All right. So for now, let's play some trivia.
Let's do it.
All right, the trusted box. See how we do this time. Category this time is real name. Oh, it's our favorite.
We struggle with this at times.
Okay, so what is Elvis Costello's birth name? Now, this one I might not know. Jason McCarthy.
No.
Declan McManus. Edward Davis. Or Jeffrey Elvis Brown.
Man, I really have no idea.
I don't have a clue either.
I really don't. I'll just take a stab at it, and something tells me Elvis won't be part of his name. I'm going to say it's either B or C. So you pick one, and I'll ride with it.
Or Edward. I bet it's Edward. I'm going to guess C.
Let's go with that one.
Okay.
We'll ride with that.
All right, here we go. We truly don't know this one.
I really don't know.
Oh, it's Declan. So, yes, Declan McManus.
Was B.
It was B.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give credit to you for that one because you said B or C. I'll give you half credit.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
We're on a curve. First of all, I love Elvis Costello.
Yeah, you could call him a revolutionary of his own.
For sure. And, man, I mean, at the time, he was one of the most important acts, and in retrospect, very, very highly thought of. An amazing songwriter and an amazing singer. I don't think he ever really got the credit he deserved for being a great singer, because if you don't think the guy can sing, listen to the records again. He's amazing.
Yeah, and a great songwriter as well.
For sure.
Definitely the godfather of 80s alternative.
Yeah.
All right. So there you go, guys. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with that part 2 episode very soon.
Can't wait.
All right. Take care.
Yep.